So, hello and welcome back to almost our last chapter of The Phoenix Transformed. It's kind of bizarre and kind of crazy that we only have two chapters left in this book. Honestly, though, the final chapter probably should have been two because it's got a lot in it. I'm probably not going to break it up or anything, but it's a whopping big chapter with a lot of stuff in it. I hope you guys are enjoying this. I hope that if you ever get the chance and if you ever run across this in a bookstore or anything like this, that you pick up the series. It's a really good one. And again, it's one of those that I don't know which of the trilogies I like better. There are pros and cons to both of them, and this one has a lot of pros on it, but it does have a couple big cons that we'll get to when we wrap up the entire series. Um, but yeah, we only have two chapters left. And in the last chapter, we learned lots about volcanoes, including the fact that there's no way on this planet I can say the elven word for volcano because I don't think it's a word. I mean, even Tercel calling it a Techuco is a bit much, but at least Techuco is a little bit easier to say than whatever that almost an entire line on a paperback novel is. That is one quibble I have with these books. But then again, probably when these books were written, they weren't thinking of anyone trying to say these words out loud. They just looked really good on paper. That's my theory anyway. It's probably not the reality. I'm sure that the authors have some idea of how these words are to be pronounced, but I definitely don't. But yeah, the Harrier and Tercel and the remaining Isvi people finished up everything at the oasis. They cleaned it out. They slaughtered all of the sheep and goats because Harrier's plan now is to push for Abi Abadashar, which we know is warded from demonic magic, and his plan is to leave all or almost all of the Isvani people there, and for him and Tercel and Bisochim and Saravase to push on to the Lake of Fire, where hopefully the Fire Crown will keep its word. So that was the plan. They're being attacked as they go, which is not exactly good. And Shariah put the idea into Harrier's mind that maybe Tercel is, maybe Ann Keldar is not actually gone. Maybe Tercel just doesn't want to draw on his magic. Like I said at the end of the last chapter, I don't think that if Harrier were thinking straight, that would even be a thought in his mind. But hopefully that will get resolved in this next chapter. So it is time to jump back in to chapter 19 of The Phoenix Transformed by Mercedes Lackey and James Mallory, and do as good as I can to recap it. And chapter 19 is titled To the Throat of the Crucible. We open this chapter with the fact that they're actually starting to be able to see the cliffs around the Lake of Fire, and that means that they're getting close to Abi Abadashar. And it also brings some new challenges. And one of those challenges is that the Isvani people, because they've never had to deal with rain, don't know how to deal with food preservation in rain, and a lot of their food that they were counting on starts to go bad. The grain starts rotting because Although the Isvani people make a really good basket to carry stuff in, they've never had to waterproof anything before, so all the grain is wet, moldy, spoiled, and even though Bisochim can heal the people, a lot of them aren't asking Bisochim for help because Bisochim is stretched so thin just trying to keep rain happening in a place that's never meant to have rain. And so illness spreads throughout the camp as they're going towards Abi Abadashar, and more people die. 10 days after they enter the Berileth, the hottest part of the desert, they finally reach Abi Abadashar. When Harrier had led the Isvani away from the Lake of Fire almost a half a year ago, he had led 10,183 people into Abi Abadashar. He's now leading 3,009, because that is all of the Isvani people who are left in the entire world, except for the small children and the pregnant women that they hope are still alive down in Abi Abadashar. They get there. Shariah tells them that they're just going to all go in. The people are still there, which is wonderful. In fact, they are there. They are fairly well fed, complaining about all the water because they don't know why it's been raining for like 2 months now. But they get there, and it's good. Although Tercel discovers that he doesn't really want to go in. In fact, he finds himself crying for Ankeldar. He doesn't want to go back to where he lost him. Tercel shook his head, angrily, wordlessly, still coughing as he breathed in ragged, half-hitched sobs. He couldn't remember if he had cried when Ankeldar left. Why was he crying now? There wasn't any point. Tears would not banish an iron, only dying would. A particular death, his. Because any dragon-bound mage would do for the Fire Crown's sacrifice, but if the sacrifice worked, they were going to need Bisochim's magic after to fix everything Aniran had wrecked. Tercel tries to stop Saravase from going into Abi Abadashar because he doesn't want her to disappear as well. Not only because he's afraid that then Bisochim would be in the same state he is, but because she's his friend now. But he finally goes in, after cautioning Saravase to be careful, please be careful. And she says, I don't want anything to happen to me either. I'll be careful. Now you just go. And Tercel goes in, and he's kind of shocked anew. The most heartbreaking thing that Tercel saw through all the long hours of that day was the sight of women and children looking not even for their husbands and parents and families, but just looking for their tribes. The Kamazan, the Barantur, the Binzarin, the Thalundi, gone. There were only a handful of Adante left. Most of the Karegi were dead, most of the Lazender, most of the Kadastar, most of everyone. There had been more people just in the Karegi Isvani a year ago than there were Isvani in all the tribes put together now. This sends Tercel into utter despair. And Tercel's despair gets worse later when he takes Bisochim down and discovers that Bisochim can actually read the elven script on the walls. This is after about a week of being in Abi Abadashar. Harrier had wanted to leave for the Lake of Fire immediately, but Shariah had told them that they all needed time to regain their strength before their last push to reach the Lake of Fire. When Harrier had unwarily said that he planned on taking only a few people with him, enough to be able to defend against whatever Aniron might throw at them, but very few so that they could travel quickly, Shariah had asked him who he was taking. The arguments had raged for days because, to Harrier's utter disgust and bafflement, every single person wanted to go. The leaders had finally agreed on a lottery system, with Harrier reserving the right to pick outright 25 of the 100 who would go and to reject 25 lottery winners outright and require a substitute to go in their place. Tercel, thinking about this, doesn't really care because he knows he's going. And so he and Bisochim start exploring because Tercel's kind of maybe hoping that Bisochim can help him figure out what happened to Ankeldar. Tercel drew a deep shuddering breath as Bisochim said that he could read the walls. "It speaks of the time of 3 becoming 1, said Bisochim, running his fingers over the carving on the wall. "Of a time to come when dragons will no longer have to die. I've been a fool to unleash a demon when safety for my Saravase was here all along." For a moment he looked so devastated that Tercel couldn't bring himself to say anything. "But we don't know when this time is going to be, do we?" said Tercel. "No," said Bisochim. "The great elven queen, who was both the destruction and deliverance of the elder kindred, and her dragon, Tanathe the White, the great mother of all dragons, foresaw a time when the mage price would at last have been paid for the spells that the great queen cast so that mages could bond with dragons and use their magic. But they also saw that its fulfillment would require a magic not yet in the world." He moved further down the wall, his fingers tracing the shapes that looked so much like the glyphs of high magic. "The transfer of the bond. Once it was a thing done always, for the elder kin would ever meddle and mock at any yoke set to bind them. Though there was but one generation of elven mages who could claim the dragon bond, for the great queen vowed in the name of the generations unborn to renounce her people's magic for the sake of victory and the long peace, until the last child of the sanctuary of Leaf and Star was dead. The dragon bonds of both the war hunt mages could be transferred from mage to mage, and so the time of the ancient dragon bond, before men, before wild mages, endured for almost 2,000 wheels of the seasons." 2,000 years, thought Tercel. But how? In that age, and as in this, each dragon bond elven mage was given to wield a single great spell, to be used but for that one purpose. "To transfer the bond," said Tercel. "It was lost very long ago," said Bisochim. "The elder kin did not wish to remember that time, and men did not know to seek the knowledge. Even I know not if such a spell would be mine to cast," said Bisochim. "Even if you could, even if they could, wild mages didn't bond to dragons until the Great War," said Tercel. "I don't think anyone would have had time to find someone that a dragon could bond to and cast that great spell before they died." They talk a little bit more, and then Bisochim asks Tercel to take him to where Ankeldar disappeared. I do like this clarification on exactly what was written on the walls, because Tercel did figure out a lot of it with Ankeldar's help, but he didn't know all of it. And it's interesting that Bisochim learned to read ancient Elvish just by trying to decipher different spells and different spirit journeys. I do find that interesting. But the two of them descend a little bit further, thankfully without Saravase, because Tercel is not willing to risk her. And they get to the place where Ankeldar vanished. Bisochim, he says that he knows what it is. Bisochim got to his feet. A door. A way for dragons and their bondage to escape. Should a city be attacked by the Andarkan, the dragon bond would defend it to the last, and then make their way to such a place as this. No, said Tercel, shaking his head. I'm sorry, you're wrong. If that was just some kind of mage door, I would know. I would still sense Ankeldar, and he would have come back. Yes. Bisochim's voice was barely above a whisper, but his expression held so much pity that it choked the words in Tercel's throat. He's dead. That's what you're going to say, isn't it? Said Tercel. The magic is old, and it sucked him in anyway because he's a dragon, and now he's dead. Not yet, said Bisochim. And there was still that terrible pity on his face and in his voice. Did a dragon-bound mage merely flee across the land, they would bring the enemy upon another fortress not ready to repulse them. The dragon bonds fled also across Sen nights, moon turns, leaving behind no trail that even the magic of the Andarkan could find. Tercel shook his head, trying to make Bisochim's words make sense. Across moon turns? By magic? The wild magic had spells to show what could be. That was what scrying was. The high magic had spells to show what had been. To know and recollect were two of them. He had read their descriptions, even if he couldn't cast them. Bisochim had said that he had looked at the past, so Tercel supposed that the wild magic could do that too, but this wasn't the same thing as going there. But if he went into the past, then wouldn't there have been two of them there? And wouldn't he still be there? The past. Or to a time not yet, said Bisochim. I cannot say where the door goes, Tercel. Nor was it ever meant that the two halves of a dragon bond should be separated by a door such as this. Even with all of Saravase's power to call on, I cannot open it to allow you passage. Yet my beloved could open it with her lightest touch. Dragon and bonded were meant to go through it together. Tercel knew that he should say something, anything. If he could think of something to say, maybe he could come up with the right questions to ask, the questions that would get him answers that would let him figure out a way to fix it. He only realized that he was swaying on his feet and about to fall when Bisochim grabbed his arm. I'm sorry, Tercel, said Bisochim. And Tercel knew then that he couldn't fix it. If there even was a way, there wasn't time. Their whole plan to have the Fire Crown trap an iron relied on keeping the attention and interest of a great power and a demon. And if Tercel did fix it and got Ankeldar back, he would just have to choose between killing Bisochim and Saravase or killing Ankeldar. I'm going to do that anyway, Tercel realized. And I've made my choice. At least this way, I won't have to look Ankeldar in the face when I do it. I know, he forced himself to say. It's not your fault. It isn't anybody's fault. And that's the worst of all of it, he thought. So now Tercel knows that Kerto was right. Ankeldar is not somewhere, he's somewhen. Probably in the future, and probably very confused, but he's somewhere. And that kind of makes it even worse. So It's now been about a fortnight that they have been in Abbey Abadashar, and they are going to be leaving for the Lake of Fire in 2 days. And Harrier has already used up 15 of his 25 refusals, and he has already made 23 of his choices of the 100 who are supposed to go with him. And he's trying to figure out what his last choice will be. And I am going to be reading a whole lot because this is all really good. And getting to the end of the book means we're probably going to have to read bigger chunks. But I will stop and interject my thoughts just to keep this very copyright friendly. But one of his first refusals was his own brother, because Eugens wants to go with him and didn't really understand right up until the last minute that Harrier doesn't think he's coming back. Harrier also tells Cave and Magistrate Parazel that they are also not coming with him, although they don't seem to want to at all, which is kind of good. But Harrier finally makes his brother realize that he has to live through this and go back home to let everybody know what happened. That is a sobering thing to have laid on you, but they're going to at least try it. But now it's pretty much time. It was midday. Here in the garden, at the top level of Abbey Abadashar's underground world, it was warm and wet. After the killing journey to reach this safe harbor, most of the Isvani preferred to be warm and dry, so he and Shariah had the entire garden to themselves, which was why Harrier had picked it. He had given all his refusals and made all of his choices but one when he asked Shariah to walk with him. He was glad to see that the forest had survived the change in the weather. In fact, everything was thriving. The goats, the squirrels, the monkeys, the doves, the chickens, and probably several other kinds of animals that he couldn't see. He hoped so. Even using the shotars as food, the people of Abbey Abadashar were going to reach the point soon where they would have to rely so heavily on the underground forest and the animals that lived here that they would probably use them up. But that was next moon turn's problem, and he probably wouldn't live to see the next moon turn. "We leave tomorrow," said Harrier. "You do," said Shariah. "The drawing of lots is complete." Kamar won. I refused him. It had been his last chance to refuse someone a place in the 100, and Harrier was glad that he'd held back so many till the last minute. "That is a good thing," said Shariah. "It would be well for the Nalzindar to have their second-in-command's wisdom to guide them." Leofa won. I'm pretty sure she cheated. Anyway, I reminded her that I said that no leaders should draw or dice for a place. "And so I have not," said Shariah. "I know," said Harrier. They walked on in silence for a while, in the direction of the waterfall and the pond. In the open areas, the light was soft and diffuse, but it was dark under the trees without the bright, hot sun of the desert day forcing itself through every crack in the stone. So Harrier conjured a ball of cold fire to show the way. He remembered the evenings when the four of them, him, Tercel, Shariah, and Sinarin, would walk down here. He remembered that he had thought then that he was living a life of danger and privation. He hadn't minded, but he had still thought it. "And I know, as all know, that you said you would choose 25 warriors to ride at your right hand to do battle with the demon Aniran, and you have only chosen 24. I ask you now," said Shariah, "who is to be the last?" They had reached the pool, and Harrier stopped. Little here had changed. The ancient willow trees still bent low over the water. The carpet of thick moss was still ridiculously soft underfoot. The only difference was that the waterfall wasn't a gentle trickle cascading from above, but a forceful jet of water that spewed straight out of the wall before plunging down just inside the edge of the pool. Shariah stopped beside him, and Harrier turned to face her. If I choose someone else, and we ride out, will you stay here? She looked up into his face. No. Harrier closed his eyes. Then I choose you. And I choose you, Harrier, as long as it pleases the sand and star to grant us. And so Harrier makes his last choice, which is probably a very hard one because we do know that he is in love with Shariah, and that is where I will do a little quibble. Not a big one, but a little quibble. And that's, I felt it in the Obsidian trilogy, and I kind of feel it in this one. Romance, well, wonderful, kind of feels forced in both of the trilogies to me. I'm not a very romantic person. I'm not really good at romance. I don't read lots of romance, but it almost feels shoehorned in. Although I think that this book does it a little bit better than Obsidian Trilogy. Obsidian Trilogy, I mean, I guess Kellen would have fallen for Vistakia. I don't even know if I'm saying that name right anymore. I could see that maybe he would fall for her, but it did feel a little bit more forced. Although, to be fair to Kellen, he was laboring under a vow of a year and a day of chastity, so that felt a little bit better in my mind. But Shariah and Harrier, I just wish that if they were going to have the romance in, they would have sprinkled it in a little bit heavier, because it did feel a little bit forced to me. But we deal with what the authors intend, and they are in love. In fact, that almost sounded like marriage vows to me. I don't know how marriages are done, at least among the Isvani people. So they depart. And it's actually kind of easy. The one thing that they are very worried about is once they get out of the range of Abi Abadashar and the magic, that they now have to deal with the ash that's still falling. And because they are so much closer to the Lake of Fire, they're starting to have to deal with what sounds like probably obsidian, volcanic rock and obsidian that's been spewed out just all over the desert. They deal with that. Thankfully, it's not too sharp, so it's not cutting up their Shotar's poor soft feet, but they deal with that, and it's kind of amazing. It only takes them a fortnight to reach the Lake of Fire. 4 days longer than it had taken just the four of them the first time, because this time Harrier is bringing the warband by a long curving route that angled south and west so that they could reach the western face of the Lake of Fire instead of the northern one. 100 warriors, Harrier, Tercel, Bisochim, and Saravasi, left Abi Abadashar. 100 warriors, Harrier, Tercel, Bisochim, and Saravase, reached the Lake of Fire. Aniron did not attack them once. Tercel is grateful about that because he doesn't need attacks, on top of the fact that he can still hear Aniron's voice in his mind. She's whispering, gloating, laughing, and he can't tell anymore whether it's a vision, a dream, a nightmare, or whether he's just finally going crazy. He doesn't tell anybody about this. He figures he can't really tell anybody about this. because they're already dealing with enough. But he does think about all of the stuff that he's got to do, especially the fact that now he knows that Bisochim, or at least according to Bisochim, that Ankildar is maybe in the future, maybe in the past, and he's thinking about his bargain a lot. When he fulfills his bargain with the Fire Crown, Ankildar would die. Ankildar wasn't dead. Tercel finally believed that. Ankildar had fallen through a mage door built more than 12,000 years ago, and he was tumbling somewhere through space and time, and whenever and wherever Ankildar came out, the fact that Tercel was dead was going to kill him. But he had no choice. They had been marked for death from the moment they had bonded. And so Tercel says nothing to anyone as they draw near to the Lake of Fire. Tercel thinks a little bit more. Now that Harrier couldn't stop him from reaching the Lake of Fire, even if he tried, because Tercel could walk there by himself if he had to, Tercel finally let himself think about what was going to happen. In one way, he had been preparing to die ever since he had accepted his destiny. Such an utterly ridiculous phrase. In another way, it had kept not happening for so long it was hard to believe it was actually going to happen tomorrow. He knew that the preceptors of light said that you didn't miss anything after you were gone because the eternal light didn't work that way, but what if they were wrong? What if being dead was like being sent somewhere far away and never being allowed to come back? No, it couldn't. The light was good. It wouldn't make you unhappy forever. Even though he was ready to think about dying now, Tercel tried not to think about how, because he was pretty sure that gives up his life at my shrine entirely of his own free will translated into throws himself into the Lake of Fire while he's still alive, and Tercel prayed that he would have the strength to do it when the moment came. Thinking about Aniron, what she had done and what she meant to do, he thought he could, but just because he was willing to give up his life didn't mean that there weren't things that he regretted leaving behind. He would miss his family. But more than that, he would miss knowing what was going to happen to them during all the years he should have been able to share with them, seeing his little sisters and his baby brother grow. Not getting to know was like having to put down a book in the middle and knowing that you were never going to get to finish it. He would miss Harrier. He would miss Harrier and Shariah. He had watched them fall in love, but he would have liked to watch them be in love. At least the fact that they had found each other meant that Harrier wouldn't have to be all alone after. Maybe the wild magic would keep Harrier from feeling lonely. Tercel didn't know, but he was sure that Shariah would take care of him. There were a lot of things that he regretted leaving behind because of what he had to do tomorrow. But at least, and Light forgive him for the thought, at least he would be able to stop missing Ankildar. That is something that you often think about, or at least I do. I mean, maybe I'm a little bit morbid, but I like the way he put it. You know, I mean, if you knew that you were going to cease to exist the next day, I would hope that I would handle it as well as Tercel is handling it. Because it would be like putting down a book in the middle and knowing that you're never going to get to finish it. And that would be terrible. And it seems so not fair. It does seem not fair. Anyway, Tercel is thinking, like I said, all of these thoughts. And he kind of halfway dozes. And he wakes up, jarred out of an uneasy doze by people shouting, roaring, yelling, They sound furious. Tercel comes out of the tent and realizes it's not raining. Harrier tells him to get back in the tent because Aniran is here. Everybody looks, and Saravase points out that once everything calms down, that Aniran, yeah, she's there, but she's not doing anything. She's waiting. For what? Harrier demanded. For us, Tercel heard himself say. She wants us to go to the Lake of Fire. She thinks that she'll win there. From out of the darkness, Tercel heard a sound that he couldn't immediately identify. All at once it resolved itself, like an illusion becoming a reality or a riddle that you solved, into the sound of laughter from a creature that had never been meant to laugh. Aniran. Saravase yells at Aniran to go away. It doesn't work. She doesn't go away, and Harrier just kind of says, all right. Everybody up, saddle the Shotars, leave the tents. We'll either be back for them or we won't, but let's do this. And I'm going to read the end of this chapter completely, so it'll be a couple of minutes, but it's really good. All along the column behind him, Tercel heard the murmured words of the Litany of Light. He didn't think it would help much now. He had worried during the entire journey that Aniran might not show up, but she had. All he could hope for now was that this would end the way the Fire Crown had promised him it would. Aniran was mounted on a coal-black Shotar, and she led an army of monsters. A pack of black dogs loped behind and around her Ashtaban Shotar as if they were hunting hounds. Behind the black dogs followed rank after rank of shamblers. They were the desiccated kind that she called up from the Atreyu cities, and it was chillingly obvious that Aniran had completed their failing, mutilated bodies with pieces of the Isvani dead dug from the sand. The surface of the bodies swarmed with the glittering forms of Ashtaban insects. Behind the shamblers scuttled sandwalkers. 5 or 10 would have been enough to kill most of the Isvane there before Bisochim could even destroy them. There were about 30. In the sky above, Bulwarta soared over Aniran's line of march, looking like a hideous mixture of wasp and jari, but the size of a dragon. If she had wanted to, Aniran could have obliterated everyone in the column instantly. The shamblers wouldn't even have had a chance to reach them before other creatures wiped them out, but she didn't. She merely rode in parallel to them, about a mile away, matching her speed to theirs. Tercel could hardly imagine what animals that had not been through this entire journey with them, what animals that hadn't been through shamblers and sandwalkers and black dogs and Bulwarta and goblins would have done on this morning's ride, but their Shotars were a little more skittish than normal. That was about it. If the terrible procession had gone on for too long, Tercel thought that someone, maybe even Harrier, might have simply charged Aniran's army. Tercel wondered if that was what she was hoping for. He wondered what made her so confident that she was willing to mass such an enormous force and not use it. She could take the entire warband prisoner, alive even, and then she would have what she had wanted from the beginning, him, Harrier, and Bisochim, along with 100 hostages. But Aniran did nothing. And 4 hours after they had set out, the band arrived at the foot of the Lake of Fire. They reached another ring of demarcation an hour before they reached the Techuco itself. This one hadn't been caused by any sort of spell, but by the force of the Techuco's creation. and the rain that had followed. Inside it, there were no boulders, no thick scurf of stone and cinder, just pools of smoke-blackened water glittering and steaming in the heat of the morning sun, and a black mud that crackled as it dried. Beyond the mud, there was stone. It lay dark and smooth in the sun, sloping upward towards the immense height of the Tichuco itself. The shapes that it made gave the illusion that the Tichuco was the trunk of some enormous stone tree, and in the curves and ridges of the stone over which they rode, Tercel could see that the stone had run out across the desert like wax, slowing and spreading as it cooled and hardened. At last, they reached the base of the lake of fire itself. The cliff around it was as smooth as the trunk of a tree, and that it so oddly resembled, and Tercel could see that there was no way to get to the top. He had no doubt that he had to get there. The bottom would not be where the shrine a race of creatures made of living fire had created. "Now what?" said Harrier, looking up. "Now I have to get to the top," said Tercel. He saw Harrier's eyes flickered, and he realized that somewhere deep inside, Harrier must know what he was about to do, but all Harrier said was, "How?" "The 100 Isvani." Would they call them the 100 someday? Would they tell impossible stories about them, he thought. They were all crowded around the base of Telenchital on their shotars, unconsciously trying to put as much distance between themselves and an iron as they could. She and her army had stopped at the edge of the stone at the mountain's base. She seemed content simply to wait. "Saravase, can you climb that?" said Saravase. "Or were you thinking I could fly to the top?" She banged her bandaged stump of her shredded wing in irritation. Tercel sighed. It had been worth a try. He would have preferred it, since it would have meant that he could go up with only Saravase as company. "Can you make steps?" he said, turning to Bisochim. "It shall be done." Bisochim dismounted from his shotar. When he did, Tercel did too. As he noticed with a mixture of resignation and disquiet, so did Harrier and Shariah. They began arguing with each other in low voices. Tercel turned away and watched the side of the mountain. His heart was beating fast now, and despite the heat from the sun in the sky and the stone below his boots, he felt cold. He was glad he hadn't eaten anything before starting out. Nobody had, but he was suddenly so thirsty. It seemed like too much trouble to get his water from his saddle, though. At first there was nothing to see, though Bisochim was standing in a pose of fierce concentration. Then suddenly nausea hit Tercel, forcing him to his knees. Tercel was so exhausted, so focused on what he was about to do, that it actually took him a minute to realize that this was normal. Wild magic and high magic not getting along. Harrier comes over and picks him up and says, "Idiot, how are you going to talk to the fire crown if you can't stand up?" "I'm not going to talk to it, Harrier," thought Tercel. He clutched at Harrier's arm, gasping for breath, too dizzy and sick to stand on his own. Waves of chill and fever racked him, and all he wanted to do was just lie down. But when he heard the rattling cascade of pebbles, he opened his eyes and looked up. Part of the edge of the mountain top was crumbling away. As Tercel watched, suddenly a bright golden spill of rock came flowing down the side of the mountain. Bisochim didn't move, and Tercel couldn't. Glowing rock poured down the side of Telenchital like syrup out of a jar, and only when Tercel opened his mouth to shout a warning, though everybody was watching, did he realize he didn't feel any heat. The stream spread and thickened as it flowed downward, and Tercel could see that the rock wasn't just flowing down through the crack in the top of the mountain, but streaming up over the lip above, as though Bisochim's spell was somehow pumping the rock out of the lake of fire. When the rock reached the bottom, there was so much of it glowing so bright that he had to look away, but there was still no heat. "Nice," said Harrier. As the light from the rock began to dim, Tercel realized that his nausea and dizziness were fading too. When he felt steady enough to stand on his own, Tercel stepped away from Harrier and opened his eyes. In place of the smooth face of Telinchitel, there was a staircase leading up the side of the mountain. It was a perfectly ordinary stone staircase, except for the fact that it glowed red-orange with heat. Whatever Bisochim had done to keep them from being fried by the molten stone had ended when his magic did. The stairs were still hot enough that everyone but Saravase moved back. "A few moments, and it will be cool enough that you may walk on it," said Bisochim. "How did you do that?" said Harrier. Bisochim smiled. "Magic?" Harrier glanced over his shoulder. Tercel followed his gaze. Aniron still hadn't moved. The black dogs were all lying down now, panting in the heat. The fact that they could behave so much like real dogs made Tercel want to cry, and he didn't know why. He thought of the Akulas that had been a distant cousin to these creatures, only the Akulas were children of light, just as the Asvai were, and Aniron's creatures had been tainted and twisted at the moment of their creation, but he wondered if deep inside the black dogs remembered what they had been meant to be. Behind the dogs, the shamblers stood motionless, glittering in the sunlight as the insects they carried crawled over them. The only movement on the desert was the Balwartas soaring in circles high above. "I want you to stay here with Xanatar," said Harrier. And for a moment Tercel thought that Harrier was talking to him. "Then want must be your master, Harrier, for I will not," said Shariah. If I would just listen to your excellent reasons to do as I am bid." "The blue robes counsel, Harrier. They do not command." "Just because I'm going up the side of this stupid Tachuko doesn't mean you have to," snarled Harrier. "Aniron is out there." "So it will be much safer if I am as far away from her as possible," said Shariah. "Wait," said Tercel. "You aren't planning to come to the top with me, are you?" "Sure am," said Harrier. "Why shouldn't I?" "Well, because you shouldn't, that's why," said Harrier. He looked hopefully at Shariah, but she shook her head, refusing to argue for him. "This is something I lied to you," said Harrier. What?" "I lied to you," Harrier repeated. "Remember Kerta?" "She's a unicorn," said Tercel. He looked towards Aniron's army. No movement, and he looked towards the staircase. Bisochim shook his head. It still wasn't cool enough to climb. "Yes," said Harrier. "Our friend Kerta, the unicorn that I called to ask about Ankeldar. There was a mage price for that. I told you it was a light one. I lied to you." Tercel had always known that Harrier had lied about something, but if it was this... what was the price? "It was a heavy one. I haven't paid it yet. I'm going to the top with you." "I will go as well," said Bisochim. He placed a foot on the lowest step and nodded in satisfaction and began to climb. Harrier sighed. "I thought you would." And up they go. I figured I should probably break in with some of my own thoughts so that, we can keep this all copyright safe. But yeah, a lot of threads are coming together now. Why Shariah thinks she has to go, I mean, I do understand that, but now everything's coming together and we're heading to the top of the volcano. Well, the lip of the volcano where the lake of fire now resides. It was a long climb to the top, and when Tercel had imagined it, he had imagined being alone. He hadn't thought it would be all five of them, because Saravase was following Bisochim up the staircase as well. The stairs were cool enough to walk on, but they were still hotter than ordinary rock, and that had been hot enough that he could feel it through his boots. Tercel tried not to imagine what was coming, but he was terrified. The Fire Crown had said he had to give up his life of his own free will, and Tercel wanted to be willing, but what if being afraid of how much it would hurt meant that he wasn't willing? How could he know? He could die and it could all be for nothing. Stop it, he told himself. If you're thinking like that, you are thinking whatever Aniran wants you to think. The demons are the ones who care whether or not you're scared. The Fire Crown doesn't understand feelings at all. It won't even notice. He felt a little better after that. You think I don't know what you're planning to do, said Harrier when they were halfway up. But I do. And I'm saying you haven't thought it through. What if it doesn't work? What if you're wrong? And what if it does work? Tercel clenched his hands into fists and then ducked his head. If he hadn't, he might have tried to push Harrier off the stairs. Now, he thought, you're bringing this up now? That would be a good thing, right? Not that I know what you're talking about, Tercel answered when he had his voice under control again. He knew what Harrier was doing. Harrier was doing what Harrier had done for as long as they had known each other. Poking him, prodding him, trying to get him to lose his temper, lose his head, to react. The stakes were too high this time. Sure it would. If Aniran's the only demon out there, how do we know what she's been up to? How do we know that the Fire Crown isn't going to cheat? How do we know that binding her is really going to actually, bind her? She wasn't even here when she caused all the original trouble. And with you and Bisochim gone, all the things that she's called up are going to still be out there. And I would just like to point out that after they wipe us all out, they're going to go looking for other things to wipe out, said Harrier, still using his most irritating, reasonable voice. Not Bisochim. The two of them had reached the top. The heat was nearly intolerable, and Tercel knew he and Harrier couldn't spend much time up here. Well, they'd both be leaving soon, just not by the same path. Just me, he said. The staircase ended in a flat platform. It was as wide as the staircase itself and perfectly square. Shariah and Bisochim had stopped several steps below, taking as much shelter from the heat as they could. Tercel looked out across the fire-crowned shrine. A lake of liquid rock bubbled and boiled perhaps 100 feet below the platform. A furnace-hot wind blew over him and Harrier, pushing them back from the edge. This wasn't the lake of fire from Tercel's visions, but seeing it gave him a shock of recognition just the same. It was here it had all begun, and here is where it would end. He didn't see the Fire Crown anywhere. Maybe it was in the lake? Just you, said Harrier. His voice was flat. Really? They stood on the platform facing each other. The height was almost like seeing the world from the back of a dragon, but Harrier was focused too intently on him to take advantage of it. Tercel had seen it, though. His winning argument. And Aniran was the one who gave it to him. A dragon-bound mage to seal the bargain. Power the spell? I don't know. It could be Bisochim or me. The Fire Crown doesn't care, but if it's Bisochim, Saravase dies too. You said yourself that Bisochim is better at magic than I am, and you'll need that. So it's me, Hare. We're out of time. We have to take the chance. Look. Harrier took him by the arm before looking away, as though he thought that Tercel might be intending to pull one last trick while his attention was diverted, but it wasn't going to be necessary. From their vantage point, here at the top of Telenchital, in the crystalline brightness of the morning light, they could see the Dove Road, and advancing down it was a long line of Isvani. Hundreds, thousands, everyone that they had left behind in Abiabadashar. And that is where the chapter ends, on what is quite the cliffhanger. So all the cards are on the table now. Harrier knows exactly what the bargain is that Tercel struck up, and Tercel knows that Harrier has a very heavy mage price. Although Harrier's mage price might just turn out, and I'm sure Harrier is thinking that his mage price is giving up Tercel. So yeah, everything ends in the next chapter though. So be sure and join me as we finish off the book. Not tomorrow night, because tomorrow night it's Pride and Prejudice, but on Wednesday night. So yeah, it's heavy. Lots and lots and lots of people died to get here in this point of the book, and at least in Tercel's mind, just one more. But we'll have to see how it all shakes out. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me. It's been almost an hour again. I don't know how that keeps happening. I'm like, okay, this is a much shorter chapter. I'm sure I can get through it in less than an hour. An hour later, here I am sitting here still. Anyway, thank you for listening. I hope that you enjoyed at least kind of that. Tell me what you think is going to be happening down in the comments below. I am really curious to see what you guys are thinking of the story so far. Also, if you listened to Obsidian Trilogy before I had to pull it for copyright stuff, if you listened to that or if you've read that, which romance do you think was better? And why? I'm very curious about that. Again, I'm not a big romance book reader, so maybe this doesn't feel forced to anybody else. It just kind of felt a little bit forced to me. But that's just a me thing. Anyway, thank you so much for listening. Please do leave me a thumbs up if you don't mind. Don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you next time.